There is nothing out here. No houses. No lights. No sound of traffic filtering through the trees. Only the Plumas National Forest pressing in from every side, and the road, if you can still call it that, buried so deeply under snow that the white and the dark have become the same thing. The pines stand like sentinels. They do not move. The cold does not apologize. It simply is, absolute and indifferent, the way wilderness always is when human beings stumble too far inside it. Somewhere up ahead, around the curve where the headlights would not have reached in time, a car sits. Dark. Still. Engine cold. It has been here a while. The doors are unlocked. The windows are up. Nothing is broken. Nothing, from the outside, looks wrong. The car is not wrecked. It is not buried to the roof. It simply stopped here, in the dark and the cold, on a road that goes nowhere useful, a road that should never have been traveled that night, and then the men who drove it walked away from it. Walked away from it into the mountains. Into the snow. Into the dark. Everything they needed to survive was still inside the car. No one could explain why they kept walking. By the time anyone found them, the mystery had only just begun. February 1978. Marysville, California. Their names were Gary Mathias, Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt. 5 men from Marysville, California, a small agricultural city in the Sacramento Valley an hour north of Sacramento. 5 men who, in February of 1978, had every reason to believe they were going to have a good night. They were not strangers to one another. They had been friends for years, part of a close circle of young men who participated in a local recreation program for adults with developmental disabilities. Several of them played on a basketball team together. Their friendship was not incidental, it was the architecture of their daily lives. They ate together. They watched television together. They showed up to the same places at the same times, week after week, month after month. They were a group in the truest sense of the word, people who made each other feel safe. Gary Mathias was 25. He had a history of schizophrenia and had been on medication to manage it, medication that, according to those close to him, had been working. He was energetic and sociable, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and showed genuine excitement when he saw a friend. He had recently been doing better, that was the phrase people used afterward, in the bleak grammar that follows tragedy. He had been doing better. Ted Weiher was 32. He was a large man, gentle and quiet, known for his patience and his warmth. He lived at home with his family. He loved watching sports and would talk about his favorite teams with a focused enthusiasm that made the people around him smile. His mother would later describe him in the spare, aching language of someone trying to contain grief within the limits of ordinary sentences. Jack Madruga was 30. He was the driver. His car, that dark blue 1969 Mercury Mornego, was the vehicle they piled into that night, the vehicle that would eventually be found 30 miles from the nearest town on a road leading nowhere. Jack had a job. He was dependable. His family knew exactly where he was going that night, because he always told them where he was going. Bill Sterling was 29. Jackie Hewitt was 24. Both of them, like the others, were embedded in the routines and relationships that give ordinary life its shape. Families who expected them home, a community that knew their faces, patterns of behavior that had repeated themselves dozens and dozens of times without incident. Nothing about these 5 men suggested catastrophe. Nothing about the evening of February 24, 1978, suggested that it would be the last ordinary night any of them would have. They were going to a basketball game. The game was being played in Chico, California, a college town about 50 miles northeast of Marysville. The UC Davis Aggies were playing the California State University, Chico Wildcats in a Northern California Athletic Conference game. The 5 men were excited about it. This was the kind of event they planned around, talked about in the days beforehand, got dressed up for. Sports mattered to them. Being together mattered to them. The combination of the two was something close to joy. They drove to Chico in Jack's car. They watched the game. People at the arena saw them. They were happy, animated, present. There was nothing unusual about their behavior, Nothing that anyone who interacted with them that night would later point to and say, "I knew something was wrong." The game ended. They said their goodbyes. They got back into Jack's car, and they drove. And somewhere on the drive back to Marysville, something changed. The normal route from Chico to Marysville is straightforward. Highway 99 south, 45 minutes, home before midnight. The road is well-traveled, well-lit, familiar. The 5 men had taken it before. There was no reason to deviate from it. But they did. Somehow, and this is one of the central mysteries, one of the questions that will never be answered with certainty, the car ended up not on Highway 99 heading south toward Marysville, but on a series of increasingly remote roads heading northeast into the mountains. Into the Sierra Nevada foothills. Into the Plumas National Forest. Into the dark. No one knows exactly when they made the turn. No one knows what was said in the car. No one knows whether Jack was driving with confidence or with confusion, whether the others were asleep or awake, whether anyone looked out the window and felt the first tremor of something being wrong. The reconstruction of this part of the journey exists only in inference and in the evidence that came later, and that evidence is the kind that creates questions faster than it answers them. What we know is this: at some point during the drive back from the basketball game, Jack Madruga's car left the route it should have been on and began traveling into terrain that none of them were equipped to navigate. The roads became narrower. The street lights disappeared. The valley floor gave way to grades and switchbacks. The temperature dropped. Snow appeared at the roadside, then on the road itself, then everywhere. They kept driving. This is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Because here is the thing about Jack's car, the thing that investigators would later note in reports filed in careful bureaucratic language that nevertheless could not disguise the horror at the center of it. The car was functional. The engine worked. The gas tank had fuel in it. The road they were on, while remote and dangerous in winter conditions, was a road. It could be reversed. A vehicle capable of climbing into those mountains was a vehicle capable of turning around and driving back out. They did not turn around. They drove to the end of the road, or near enough to it, and they stopped. And then, for reasons that no investigation has ever satisfactorily explained, they got out of the car and walked away from it into the wilderness. Why did they walk away from the car? The families began to worry immediately. These were men of routine. When Gary Mathias did not come home that night, his family noticed. When Ted Weiher did not call, his mother noticed. By morning, 5 families in Marysville were making phone calls that would not produce reassuring answers. By the end of February 25, 1978, a missing persons report had been filed. The search that followed was extensive by the standards of the time and the region. Law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and volunteers combed through areas around Marysville and the surrounding foothills. Flyers went up. Tips came in. Television news stations carried brief reports. 5 young men from a small California city had vanished on the way home from a basketball game, and in the first days of the search, there were enough rational explanations. Car trouble, a detour, a decision to stay somewhere overnight, that the dominant emotion was concern rather than dread. That changed when the car was found. On February 28, 1978, 4 days after the men disappeared, Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Mornego was discovered on a remote Forest Service road in the mountains above Oroville, California. It was approximately 70 miles from Marysville. It was on a road called the Oroville-Quincy Highway, in territory that no one in that car had any apparent reason to be in. The car was unlocked. The keys were inside. The engine, when investigators tested it, turned over. The car worked. And scattered around the vehicle, in the snow, were footprints. 5 sets of footprints, leading away from the car, heading deeper into the mountains. What investigators found inside the car compounded the confusion rather than resolving it. There were personal items belonging to the men. There was food. There were supplies that, had the men remained with the vehicle, would have helped them survive the night. The car itself was survival. It had a heater, it had shelter, it had the capacity to carry them back to civilization. And they had abandoned it. The footprints in the snow moved away from the vehicle and into the forest. They went uphill. They went away from the road, away from the warmth, away from everything rational. The search was reorganized around the car's location. Teams went into the mountains on foot and in helicopters. The terrain was brutal: deep snow, steep grades, dense forest, temperatures that dropped below freezing at night. The men, if they were out there, had been exposed to that terrain for 4 days without proper equipment, without shelter, without preparation. Days passed. The search continued. And then, nothing. No trace. No further evidence. The mountains had swallowed them. The weeks that followed were the kind that leave permanent marks on the people who live through them. The families of the 5 men existed in a particular kind of torture during those weeks, the torture of not knowing. Not knowing is different from knowing the worst. It occupies a different psychological space. It does not allow for grief, exactly, because grief requires an object, and when someone has simply disappeared into a mountain range and left no trace, there is no object. There is only the absence, which expands to fill every room, every silence, every unanswered phone call. 5 families. 5 empty chairs. 5 mothers who, when February turned to March and March turned to April, were still waiting for news that did not come. And then, in June of 1978, the mountains began to give back their secrets. Not all of them. Just enough to deepen the mystery. The snow was melting by then. The winter that had buried those mountains in February was retreating, and as it retreated it revealed what it had been concealing. On June 4, 1978, a man named Joseph Shons was traveling in the area when he came across something that would add one of the most unsettling witness accounts to a case already full of unanswered questions. But the physical discoveries came first. A Forest Service trailer was found in the mountains approximately 19 miles from where the car had been abandoned. It was a remote recreational trailer, unoccupied, stocked with basic supplies as such facilities sometimes were. Inside, investigators found evidence that someone had been there. The supplies had been partially consumed. Candles had been burned down. The mattress had been used. And most devastating of all, the body of Ted Weiher was found inside the trailer. Ted had been there for weeks. The forensic evidence suggested he had survived for an extended period, perhaps 12 or 13 weeks, after the group's disappearance. He had made use of the trailer's supplies. He had shelter, some food, some protection from the elements. And yet he had died. He had not sought help. He had not traveled the 19 miles back to the car. He had not traveled the additional distance to the nearest road where he might have been found. He had stayed in that trailer, in those mountains, alone, and he had died there. What investigators noticed, and what has troubled everyone who has studied this case in the decades since, was the condition of Ted's feet. His shoes were off. In the cold, in temperatures that dropped well below freezing at night, even in late spring at that elevation, his shoes were off. He had severe frostbite. He had lost significant weight, suggesting he had been rationing the available food carefully or had simply not been eating properly. He had survived far longer than should have been possible. And yet he had made no apparent effort to leave. This is where the timeline stopped making sense. Because 19 miles is not nothing. 19 miles through mountain terrain in winter conditions, without proper equipment, is an enormous distance that represents real danger. But it is also traversable. People walk 19 miles in a single day under good conditions. The question of why Ted Weiher, a man who survived for roughly 12 weeks in that trailer, long enough to see the worst of the winter pass, never attempted to leave is one of the questions that no one has ever answered satisfactorily. The bodies of the other men were found in the following days. Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga were found relatively close to the car. They had not traveled far. Jackie Hewitt's remains were found in a more remote area. Gary Mathias was never found. Not then. Not in the weeks and months that followed. Not ever. Gary Mathias, the young man who had been doing better, who was on medication for schizophrenia, who was by some accounts the most physically capable of the group, vanished without a trace. The mountains kept him. They have kept him since 1978. What investigators discovered next made even less sense. The forensic evidence surrounding the case was fragmentary and, in some ways, actively confusing. It did not resolve into a coherent narrative. It produced, instead, a series of data points that contradicted one another or pointed in multiple directions simultaneously. Consider the distance. The car was abandoned approximately 70 miles from Marysville, on a road that required deliberate navigation to reach. The trailer where Ted Weiher was found was 19 miles further into the mountains. The other men were found at varying distances from both the car and the trailer. Several someones, had traveled enormous distances through brutal winter terrain. And yet those same people had apparently stopped when they could have continued, had sheltered when they could have sought more permanent safety, had died within reach of resources they did not fully use. The supplies in the trailer, there were enough calories there, spread across 12 weeks of careful consumption, to have kept a man alive much longer. There was evidence that the food had been used sparingly, rationed, stretched. This was not the behavior of a man in a state of complete panic. It suggested a kind of awareness, a kind of deliberate management. And yet the shoes were off. And yet he never left. Then there is the matter of Joseph Shons. Shons was a man who had been in that area on the night the 5 men disappeared. He had been stranded in his own vehicle on the mountain road when his car slid off a snow-covered incline. He was stuck there through the night, in the dark and the cold, waiting for help. And he reported hearing voices in the darkness. He reported seeing lights. He reported that someone, or several someones, was nearby, that he called out to them and received no response, or at best an ambiguous one. He reported seeing figures near a vehicle. If Shons's account is accurate, and he maintained it consistently, then the 5 men, or at least some of them, were in the vicinity of other people in the early hours of their disappearance. People who could have helped them. People who might have given them directions, called for assistance, provided basic supplies. And nothing happened. The contact, if it occurred, did not result in rescue. Why didn't they ask for help? This question runs like a current underneath every examination of this case. Why didn't they ask for help? Why didn't Ted Weiher, during 12 weeks in that trailer, make his way toward the road? Why did the group, instead of remaining with a functional vehicle on a road where they might eventually have been spotted, walk deeper into the wilderness? Why did several of the men die within what appears to have been the range of survivable distances from help? The theories that have been proposed over the decades are numerous, and each of them contains enough plausibility to seem compelling in isolation, and enough gaps to seem insufficient the moment you push on them hard enough. The most straightforward theory is navigational error combined with panic. The car took a wrong turn, possibly because of poor visibility, possibly because road signs were unclear or snow-covered, possibly because no one in the vehicle was paying close attention to the route. They ended up on a mountain road and, realizing they were lost, continued driving rather than turning back, perhaps because turning around on an icy mountain road in darkness felt more dangerous than continuing forward. When the road became impassable, they stopped. And then fear took over. Panic does strange things to human cognition. It disrupts the capacity for rational problem solving. It can make a stationary vehicle feel like a trap rather than a shelter. It can make the forest ahead look more survivable than the road behind. People who study wilderness survival have documented, again and again, the ways in which fear causes victims to make decisions that are, in retrospect, inexplicable: to leave shelter, to remove clothing in the cold, to move toward danger when safety is behind them. The phenomenon even has a name: paradoxical undressing, in the case of those who remove clothing before hypothermia kills them. The brain, in its final moments of compromised function, can generate profound delusion. But panic does not entirely explain Ted Weiher's 12 weeks in the trailer. Panic is acute. It burns hot and fast. 12 weeks of careful food rationing is something else entirely. Another theory centers on Gary Mathias specifically. Gary had a history of schizophrenia and was on antipsychotic medication. If, for any reason, he had stopped taking that medication, or if his medication had been ineffective in managing a particular episode, his behavior might have become erratic and difficult for the others to interpret or resist. He was reportedly physically capable and socially dominant within the group. If Gary had insisted on leaving the car, if he had expressed certainty about a route or a destination with the particular conviction that can accompany certain psychiatric states, the others might have followed him. They trusted each other. They were a group. That trust, in the wrong circumstances, can become a mechanism of collective destruction. But this theory, too, has its gaps. Gary's family and caregivers had noted that he was doing well in the period before the disappearance. The evidence of his medication management was positive. And in any case, the theory cannot explain why the group did not return to the car once Gary, if he was the one leading them into the wilderness, was no longer with them. There are darker theories. This is the part of the case that sends people deep into internet archives at 2 in the morning. Some researchers have suggested the possibility of an encounter. The Plumas National Forest in 1978 was not a heavily monitored environment. Remote mountain roads in rural California in that decade were not subject to any significant surveillance. If the 5 men had encountered someone, or something, on that road, there would have been few mechanisms for detecting it. No concrete evidence has ever emerged to support this direction. But the absence of evidence, in a case where the evidence is already so fragmentary, does not feel like a complete rebuttal. It feels like another door that cannot be fully opened. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: somewhere between the basketball arena in Chico and the mountains above Oroville, something went wrong. The car ended up on a road it had no reason to be on. The men got out of the car and walked into the wilderness. Several of them died in the wilderness. One of them, Ted Weiher, survived for weeks before dying alone in a trailer. And Gary Mathias was never found. Now try to reconstruct the last days. Try to hold the timeline in your mind. Try to understand what it would have felt like. It is February 24th, 1978. Late. Maybe 11 o'clock, maybe midnight. You are in a car with 4 of your closest friends. You went to a basketball game earlier in the evening. You had a good time. You are probably tired. You are probably comfortable. The heater is running. Someone might be asleep in the back seat. And the road is wrong. The road is wrong, and at first it is just slightly wrong. The turns are unfamiliar, the landscape is unfamiliar, but roads in the dark can look like other roads, and maybe it corrects. Maybe around the next bend the lights of a gas station appear. Maybe someone says turn around here and the driver does, and you are back on the right road, and this becomes a funny story you tell later at dinner. But it does not correct. The road gets worse. The snow gets heavier. The turns feel more committed, less reversible. You are in the mountains now. You can feel the grades under the car, the way the engine labors. The valley lights are gone. There is nothing around you except forest and snow and darkness and cold. What do you do? What does the group decide? Maybe you keep driving because stopping feels like giving up. Maybe you keep driving because someone in the car is convinced they recognize this road. Maybe you keep driving because panic has not fully arrived yet and false confidence is filling its space. Maybe you keep driving because you do not know what else to do. And then the road ends, or becomes impassable, and the car stops. And then you get out. Why do you get out? Why do you walk away from shelter, from heat, from a functioning engine? The theories circle the question without landing on it. Panic. Delusion from early hypothermia. A perceived threat at the vehicle. A member of the group insisting on a route. A collective decision that the road ahead, on foot, led somewhere safe. Something seen or heard that convinced 5 people that the car was not the answer. We do not know. We have never known. The footprints go into the mountains and they do not come back, and whatever logic, however distorted, however desperate, drove those 5 men away from their vehicle into that wilderness died with them in the snow. And somewhere in those miles, in the cold and the dark, the group fragmented. We don't know when. We don't know where. We don't know what was said, if anything was said, in the moments before men who had trusted each other for years became separated in the wilderness. We know only the outcome. Some died relatively quickly, likely from exposure. Ted Weiher lived for weeks in that trailer, surviving on what was available, burning the candles down, and then dying. And Gary Mathias walked somewhere the mountains have never disclosed. Decades later, nobody has solved this part of the mystery. The families of the 5 men have carried this story for more than 45 years. The grief without closure is a particular kind of weight, not heavier, necessarily, than the grief that comes with confirmed loss, but different in its texture. It does not fully resolve. It cannot fully resolve, because the central fact of the case, what happened, exactly, on that road, in those mountains, during those weeks, remains unknown. Not merely unsolved in a police procedural sense, but genuinely, structurally unknown. The evidence that exists does not add up to a complete account. It adds up to fragments. Gary Mathias's family never had remains to bury. For years, there was a possibility, mathematical, vanishing, but real, that Gary was alive somewhere. That he had survived and wandered out of the mountains on the other side, somewhere no one was looking, and built a different life under different circumstances. This possibility was not likely. But it was not zero. And the gap between not zero and confirmed dead is a space that grief cannot properly inhabit. Investigators in Yuba County worked the case for years. It was never officially closed. Periodically, it resurfaced, a new investigator who wanted another look, a journalist who thought the story deserved more attention, a researcher who believed a new analysis of the evidence might produce something the original investigation missed. Each time, the case proved resistant to resolution. The evidence was what it was, a car on a mountain road, footprints in the snow, a trailer, a body, more bodies, no explanation. The internet, when it came, gave the case a new kind of life. Online communities dedicated to unsolved mysteries discovered the Yuba County 5 in the 2000s and 2010s and found in it something that resonated deeply, not merely the tragedy of the outcome, but the essential strangeness of the central question. These were ordinary men. They had ordinary plans. They were going home from a basketball game. And something redirected them into the wilderness and killed them, and the why of it has never been satisfactorily explained. People spend hundreds of hours on this case. They build timelines. They trace routes on satellite maps of terrain that, in 1978, had no satellite maps. They argue about Gary Mathias's medication, about Joseph Shonz's testimony, about the significance of the removed shoes, about the distance between the car and the trailer and the decisions that connect them. They cannot let it go. This is not ghoulishness, exactly. It is something more complicated. It is the recognition that this case touches something essential about the relationship between ordinary life and catastrophe, about how small the distance is between a normal evening and an irreversible one, about how quickly the familiar can become the terrifying, about how 5 people who trusted each other and who were known and loved and embedded in a community could be erased by a wrong turn on a dark road. Return to the car one last time. It sits on a mountain road and it holds its secrets with the dispassion of an object, because it is an object, and objects do not carry guilt or grief or the weight of the questions that have accumulated around them for decades. It is metal and glass and rubber. It sits where it was left. It does not explain itself. But we keep returning to it. The investigators return to it. The families return to it, in their minds, in the years after. The internet researchers return to it in their late-night reconstructions. We return to it because it is the last object that connects the ordinary world, the basketball game, the drive home, the warmth inside a moving car in winter, to whatever came after. It is the threshold. On one side of it, 5 men are coming home from a game. On the other side of it, they are walking into the dark. The mountains eventually gave back most of the men. Some answers came with them. The answers were not enough. There are things we will simply never know. We will not know what was said in that car during the hours before it stopped. We will not know what decision, or series of decisions, or panic, or confusion, drove 5 men out of a working vehicle and into freezing wilderness. We will not know what Ted Weiher thought during his weeks alone in that trailer, what he hoped for, what he feared, what kept him from walking toward the road. We will not know where Gary Mathias went. We will not know because the people who knew are gone, and the mountains that witnessed it have never spoken. 5 friends left a basketball game one night in February 1978 and started driving home. They never made it. The mountains eventually returned some of what was lost, but not all of it, and not with explanation, and not with anything that resembles the closure that the families deserved and did not receive. Somewhere between that wrong turn and the silence that followed, in the dark of the car, in the cold of the wilderness, in the weeks of impossible survival and inexplicable death, the truth disappeared with them. The road is empty now. The snow keeps falling. It has been falling, in one form or another, for 47 years.